Good morning, and welcome to the Bureau of Land Management Utah's virtual press conference. Today, we are here to announce an exciting discovery from Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which published today in the PureJ Open Access Journal. We are grateful to you and our partners for joining us here today. My name is David Herscher, and I am the Bureau of Land Management's Paria River District Public Affairs Specialist based out of Kanab, Utah. Before we start, I'll be going over some of our technical tips and the structure prior to the main event. Your cameras and microphones are currently off. As you have questions during the event, you are welcome to use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. The primary speakers today will be Harry Barber, BLM's Paria River District Manager, Dr. Alan Titus, the District Paleontologist, Dr. Selena Suarez from the University of Arkansas, and Dr. Joseph Sertich from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and Katja Knoll, the paleontologist here, or the paleontology lab for the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. Their names and titles will appear on the screen when they speak, but we will also provide this and other relevant information in the chat during this event. And biographies are also provided in the electronic press kit. Following the research presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions. During the Q&A, please raise your hand virtually and drop your questions into the Q&A chat. We will call on those with questions as we are able to do so. Please note that we are recording this event. We will also be sharing information about the discovery and answering questions from the public on our social media channels. This will include the BLM Utah Instagram webpage at Utah Public Lands. I will now turn this event to the Paria River District Manager, Harry Barber, who will now kick off this event. Good morning, Harry.
Good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Paria River District BLM Utah press conference about Teratophonius and the research conducted on Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. I'm Harry Barber, the District Manager for the Paria River District, and today I would like to introduce you to Dr. Alan Titus, our District Paleontologist. But before I do, I'd like to share a little bit about the monument and our management. Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument contains a wealth of scientific, recreational, ecological, and scientific resources, the last of which has become internationally recognized through the work of researchers. Archaeologists have documented 12,000 years of human inhabitation. Ecologists and biologists have documented plant and insect diversity that is among the highest recognized for any region in the United States. And paleontologists have found thousands of important fossil sites, including truly world-class ones, such as will be talked about today. From the monument's very beginnings, it has been the BLM's goal to regard the monument as a giant outdoor laboratory and support scientific research. This has been achieved through active engagement of our own resource specialists with a multitude of museums, universities, and other research institutions throughout the world. In fact, the work you will be hearing about shortly resulted from collaboration with the University of Arkansas, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, Maine's Colby College, Australia's James Cook University, as well as others. Now let's get back to Dr. Titus. He has worked as the monument paleontologist for nearly 21 years and began his career here as the monument's first full-time permanent paleontologist in 2000. During that time, he has led a multi-institutional partnership of museums and universities into the Badlands of the Kaparowitz Plateau to uncover the hidden ancient stories the place has to tell. Through their work, they have discovered a new treasure trove of fossils that have revolutionized our understanding of the end of the age of dinosaurs in North America. Spectacular fossil specimens of everything from plants still rooted in their original soil to dinosaurs wrapped in the impressions of their own skin, or allowing scientists to paint a picture of this important time in Earth history in amazing detail. Occasionally, the teams get exceptionally lucky and find a truly unique site like the one we're here to talk about today. Sites that go beyond just filling in the list of species that lived here millions of years ago. Sites that actually gave us insight into the possibly complex behavior of these wonderful beasts. So without any more delay, here is Dr. Titus to talk about the insight he has gained for one of these sites on the social behavior of Teratophonius. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Appreciate that introduction. And I'm excited to be here with you all today. Thank you all for joining us. And today we want to talk about an especially important site that we found in 2014, essentially a one of a kind, the first of its kind from the southern US, and a little bit about the insights that it gives us into tyrannosaur behavior near the end of the age of dinosaurs. I do want to acknowledge that this work has been interdisciplinary and collaborative, and that today I will be joined live by Dr. Selena Suarez at the University of Arkansas, who specialized in the geochemical investigations that we conducted at the site that became critical for completing the story for us. And also Dr. Joseph Sertich at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, whose expertise in tyrannosaurs and tyrannosaur biology and ecology, as well as dinosaurs in general, were critical for us developing some of the ideas about the social nature of tyrannosaurs. You'll get a chance to interact with them later on in the presentation. But I really want to explain in some detail about the site and the process that we went through to investigate it so that you can gain an appreciation for just how important this site is. So without any further ado, I would like to go ahead and start my presentation. Okay. A little bit of lag time here is, okay, so here's the team. I do want to mention Dr. Ian Glasspool from Colby College of Maine, who is our charcoal specialist. There was a fair amount of burned wood at the site, and that became important for the story as well. Dr. Selena Suarez and Daigo Yamamura, who is formerly of the University of Arkansas, were instrumental in getting the geochemical work done. And then Dr. Eric Roberts at James Cook helped us sort out the stratigraphy and the age of the site. So with all of us coming together, we were able to unravel the crime scene, as it were. It's not particularly controversial that dinosaurs were gregarious. We find many fossil sites in which especially plant eaters are buried together in large numbers. So you can imagine these dinosaurs populating areas just like a herd of wildebeest in Africa today. It's a little more controversial when you start talking about gregarious predators, because predators don't instinctively or automatically become gregarious, or at least as readily as plant eaters. So when you think about predators, there really aren't lots of examples today of large predators that behave in complex social groups like wolves or lions. I mean, those are essentially the two best examples we have today. Most predators are solitary. And the reason for that is you have to have a very special purpose as a predator to want to get together and cooperate with what were originally your competitors for prey. And that involves guaranteeing success of taking down larger animals. But it also involves a lot of complex behavior. If you're going to actually share in a hunt and have roles in a hunt and have a hierarchical structure with an alpha who's in charge, that takes a fair amount of brain power, maybe a little more than it does just for a plant eater to kind of congregate for self-defense purposes or breeding purposes. So the idea that large predators like T-Rex could have actually been social, complex hunters with role-playing and division of the hunt, you know, with ambushers and chasers, and then sharing in the kills and all that is somewhat controversial, because a lot of researchers feel like these animals simply didn't have the brain power to engage in such complex behavior. So this is sort of the classic view of tyrannosaurs as predators, the lone wolf. About 20 years ago, a little slightly more than 20 years ago, however, Dr. Phil Currie from then the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada started excavating a site at this place called Dry Island Buffalo Jump in Canada, and they uncovered the remains of a minimum of 12 individual tyrannosaurs ranging in age from practically just out of the nest all the way to full adults, reaching 25, 30 feet in length. And after they studied the site and the forensic evidence on the bones, concluded that these animals had all died in a single mass kill, a catastrophic event, and that the reason they are all buried together is because they lived together. They were actually some sort of social or gregarious group of tyrannosaurs swept up in a catastrophe, rather than individuals wandering into a place one after another, or some sort of other mechanism to concentrate them post-death. Here's Dr. Currie with the jaw of one of those Albertosaurus sarcophagus, which is the particular tyrannosaur species found at the site. That's an adult jaw there. And from this, Dr. Currie concluded that these tyrannosaurs, if they were gathering in groups and multi-generational, that they were probably behaving more like a pack of wolves than the classic solitary lone wolf predator that T-Rex had been relegated to. And that brings us to the site we want to talk about today in the northern part of the Kaparowitz unit within the Kaparowitz Plateau region of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, located on the map here with the giant red star. This is the site upon the day of discovery. The white line indicates where the first discovery bone was made. It was actually an ankle bone from an adult tyrannosaur. And within minutes of brushing around the ankle bone, we'd uncovered dozens of other tyrannosaur bones, including this large lower or hind foot toe. This is a knuckle, a segment in a hind foot. So it's a section of the toe. It's labeled 23 in the picture. There are actually other fragmentary bones off to the left. We recovered so much bone from so many different kinds of animals over such a wide area, about an acre, that we nicknamed it the Rainbows and Unicorns site. Essentially, well, I consider this a once-in-a-lifetime sort of discovery for myself. I probably won't find another site this exciting and scientifically significant during my career. Although, who knows, I could get lucky. When you assess the different kinds of animals fossilized at the site, you see a pattern and one exception to that pattern. Essentially, this is a game of one of these things is not like the other. I mean, Rainbows has a wealth of different kinds of fishes preserved in it, from garfish and sturgeons to bowfins, and even a guitarfish, which is a relative of rays, a freshwater species. And then 7 different species of turtles, including this giant thing that looks kind of like a sea turtle. We have remains of a giant alligator named Deinosuchus. And then we've got this pile of tyrannosaurs. So one of these things is definitely not like the other, and that would be the tyrannosaurs. Everything else appears to have a largely aquatic signature, be living in a large lake or river, whereas the tyrannosaurs were definitely living on dry land. So how did these tyrannosaurs end up in the lake? That becomes the first mystery we had to solve. As far as the identity of these particular tyrannosaurs, there are certain key features around the eyes and the number of teeth in their upper jaws that lead us to identify them as Teratophonius, which is the only named tyrannosaur from the Kaparowitz Formation. This is a picture of the largest adult individual from the site. That's a complete right side of the face, with the length there being in the vicinity of 1 meter. And then to give you some idea of the size range of the individuals, these are 4 of the similar position toe bones out of the site, with the largest adult individual on the right and the smallest individual on the left. The smallest individual would be about 4 years old. And plotting the size of the individuals on a growth curve against their age and years, although I have to say we didn't actually cut through the legs and count the number of years growth rings in their legs. So this is a bit of an approximation. We have a 4-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 22-year-old represented at the site, with the 22-year-old being a full somatic adult. It's fully mature, no longer growing. Okay, well, now we know what kind of animals we found at the site. Let's look at the context with which they were found. So now we have to play CSI and investigate the scene. There are two major sequences of rocks represented at the site, and both of them become important to our story, as I'll explain later. The lower sequence, pictured here as the number 1, is a series of fining upwards or decreasing grain size rock units. So you got a sandstone at the bottom, probably laid down in a river channel. Then you have a mudstone at the top, which is very fine grain, mostly fine, smooth clay, which can only settle out in standing water. So essentially, we're seeing the birth of a body of water like a lake, maybe from the channel of a river being abandoned. So we call those oxbow lakes. So the rocks indicated by number 1 are actually fine-grained sediments deposited within a standing body of water like a lake, probably an oxbow. When you look at the picture down in the bottom center of the slide, labeled Unit 3, you can see there's big white blobs in it. And those are actually calcium carbonate balls known as caliche that form when soils start to form. And so that indicates that the lake dried out before the overlying units were deposited. So we have a lake forming, it dries out, and then you probably have roots, plants growing over the former lake bed. Okay, now we're going to focus on the actual bone layer. So this is all below the bone layer, and it's separated from the overlying sequence of the bones by a very rough, erosional, sort of uneven, ragged contact. So number 1 is a situation like this. The lower sequence represents an abandoned section of river channel that's ponded with water and looks a lot like a lake. And given the cast of characters, this could actually have played out at this lake 76 million years ago. So looking at the upper sequence with all the bones, that's a completely different character of rock. Now we're looking at sandstones and pebble conglomerates, like they're larger pebbles, things that you would find in sandbars and gravel bars in the bottom of a river. So we've transitioned from lake environment in the lower sequence to a river channel. Oh, and by the way, the site, as you can see on the left, it says RUQ 76.42. That's the age of the site. I forgot to mention that. So site's been dated to about 76.42 million. So you've got these sandbars and gravel bars in which all the bone is now residing. And so it'd be easy to conclude these animals just died upstream somewhere and were washed down river during some major flood event. But it got more complicated when we started to look at the details of the bones. Okay, so here's an active river channel, the environment in which the fossils ultimately came to rest. If you look at the details inside the bones, we see two things that led us to conclude or led us to believe that these were not in their original resting place, that they'd actually been disturbed and reburied. The first is shown on the left, bits of that same white calcium carbonate caliche stuff that we'd noticed in sequence 1. And the second is greenish mudstone, clay, almost identical to that in sequence 1. So we've got the same white carbonate and the same green clay actually stuffed inside of the bones that's now completely surrounded by sand of a different nature. So it led us to believe that these had actually originally been buried in Unit 1, had been exhumed, and then reburied into the river. Now that may seem like a convoluted process and sort of complicated, but it actually occurs pretty frequently in ancient environments. So to help us fingerprint the bones and determine whether or not they might have originally been buried in Unit 3, we did detailed geochemical analysis on the stable carbon and oxygen isotopes. And this is a little bit complicated chemistry-wise, but you've got various isotopes of oxygen and carbon, and they can be used to fingerprint both the environment that an animal lived in and the environment that it was fossilized in. And it turns out, I'm not going to explain these charts in detail, but it turns out the fingerprints of the calcium carbonate in the overlying unit with the bones was the same as that in the Unit 1. So there's a connection. Also, we wanted to make sure that these animals may have all inhabited the same lake or river system versus them all being washed in from various places. And when we ran the geochemistry on the turtle shells and the fish and a lot of the other animals, it turns out they all had the same fingerprint as well. So we were fairly confident, A, that the calcium carbonate in the two units was from the same place or represented the same deposits, and that the animals all lived together in one happy lake. However, the final proof that we needed to tie all of the fossils together and to the underlying unit was found in analysis for rare earth elements. Because the objection could be, well, you don't know that they actually came from that particular place or that they were originally buried in mud. But when you run the rare earth element analysis, we can actually prove that they were originally buried in clay, like Unit 1, and that they all came out of the same place. So that's what this tightly clustered series of dots on the lower triangle is showing, that basically their signatures, their fingerprints are all the same. They came out of the exact same place. So we had final convincing evidence that these all came out of the same place. Now, I did mention the charcoal. And so what role did charcoal play in this mystery? Was it the event that killed the dinosaurs? Did a fire rage through here and sweep all these tyrannosaurs in terror out in front of it and lead them down to a lake to get out of the fire, and then they died in the flames? Or did it happen afterwards and become the catalyst for getting them unburied and reburied? So when we looked at the kinds of wood that was burned and the reflectance or the degree to which it was burned, it turned out it was a very low temperature fire. The kind of creeping, slow-moving, smoldering fire that's almost never able to kill large animals. I mean, this is the kind of fire that a tyrannosaur could have walked away from. And most of the wood was redwood. So we're looking at a burned redwood forest of a very slow-moving, low-temperature fire nature, and almost certainly wasn't responsible for killing an entire group of large animals. It could have become important for the later part of the story, as I mentioned. So let's review the hard evidence then that we've uncovered at the site. That these tyrannosaurs were initially buried together in a quiet, slack water, fine-grained mud context with all these other aquatic animals like alligatoids, which Deinosuchus is one, fish, and turtles. So they didn't get in there during a drought, is my point. They got in there while it was still a healthy lake ecosystem. Tyrannosaurs are represented by 4, with a possible 5th individual from very young to fully grown adults. These fossils were later winnowed out of their original fine-grained burial in the lake and reburied in coarser deposits of sand and gravel in a river channel, in the bars. And that we did have a fire, although we're fairly certain the fire was not responsible for the Tyrannosaur's death and probably postdated the burial of all the animals. So there it is, a very sad day in southern Utah, 76.4 million years ago, with our family of tyrannosaurs caught up, drowned, and then left stacked up like cordwood in the receding floodwaters. So just to recap that history, we have the happy lake, we have a seasonal flood, probably during the warm season or summertime. And these animals are drowned and washed into the lake setting, probably near the margin. The lake later dries out, and that's where we start getting the white balls forming. And then in the process of drying out, it also gets colonized by plants, and we see evidence of roots and things like that going through the white balls in the fossils. Now, this is where we invoke the fire. After the area had been forested, we later had a drought or a dry spell that dries the vegetation to the point where you can get a smoldering fire go through. And then in the chaos that results from the burned landscape, you can actually clog a nearby river channel with dead trees and mudslides and cause it to change course and chew its way through this former lake bottom, exhuming or winnowing out the fossils and redepositing them like such. So now we have units 4 through 5, which are the bone layers in this sort of rough, irregular, eroded contact with the underlying unit, which was the original host. All right, so that's the forensics from the site. From that, we can conclude, or we have concluded, that this group of tyrannosaurs actually died together during a single catastrophic event. Now let's compare that to the Canadian site, and then talk about the expanding pattern of these kinds of sites throughout North America. So the Canadian site's Dry Island. We have another Montana site, which I don't have enough detail to talk about specifics, just to let you know it exists with multiple tyrannosaurs, 3 individuals. And then the Southern Utah site, Rainbows and Unicorns. Oh, and it looks like Grand Staircase jumped over to the Colorado border there on my slide. Sorry about that. Comparing Rainbows and Unicorns with Dry Island, both were flood kills, except Rainbows was into a large body of water inhabited by fish and turtles and gators, whereas the Dry Island site was into a forested area with a lot of down vegetation. And so flood kills, but into slightly different settings. Both represent multi-generational kills, and finally, both were reworked with this minimal transport, leaving you a winnowed or sort of remnant pile of bones, but still they haven't been moved very far and they represent relatively complete individuals. So the similarities are striking between the 2 sites. And if Dry Island can be used as an argument for sociality or gregariousness in tyrannosaurs in Canada, we conclude that the same could be said for the site in Utah, Rainbows and Unicorns. Now, since Rainbows and Unicorns was discovered, this paper was published in 2014 talking about a track site in British Columbia in which there were multiple tyrannosaur individuals walking side by side. So you can capture a moment in time in the late Cretaceous where these large predatory dinosaurs are actually walking apparently as a group at the same time through a mudflat. Here's a map of the site showing you they're all going parallel to each other. So in summary, we do believe that the rainbow tyrannosaurs, Teratophonius, died together in a single event as a flood kill, just like has been hypothesized for the Dry Island site in Canada. This is the first such evidence of a tyrannosaur mass mortality in the southern US, and therefore an important data point in talking about the expanding pattern of such sites throughout North America. It also occurs within a completely different family of tyrannosaurs, which is an important point. That the Rainbow site is remarkably similar to the Dry Island site, and that this, as I said, represents part of an expanding pattern of mass mortality sites throughout the western part of North America. We've now got one in Utah, one in Montana, and the most famous one, of course, up in Alberta. It's a lot harder to explain this repeating pattern if these are simply just random events rather than kills affecting animals that are habitually gathering together or being gregarious. I mean, it's a lot easier to explain this pattern repeating itself in the north and the south if these animals are actually living in groups. I got one more point. And that this might indicate that this behavior, this social or gregarious behavior among these large predators was actually a pervasive feature of the animals in the late Cretaceous. And when you start looking at age disparities in the group from the very young to the very old, it is among predators starting to suggest that there is a more complex social relationship, pack behavior. You don't see these sort of multi-generational groups of things among alligators or crocodiles, which would have been the previous analogy made for these tyrannosaurs. And there is one modern example of a Coelurosaur dinosaur, a first cousin essentially, or second cousin to the tyrannosaurs today, that actually organizes packs and hunts just like wolves. It's called the Harris hawk, Parabuteo. It lives in the Sonoran Desert, and they form groups of multiple individuals. They have communal raising of the young. They share in kills, and they actually have a division of labor when they hunt, where there are pickets or sentries, and then individuals will go in on the ground and flush prey, and then they take turns hitting it. And that lowers the risk to each individual bird so that they can take down much larger prey than they would normally as a lone hawk, such as jackrabbits. So this behavior is possible among dinosaurs, because here is a modern example of a dinosaur doing just what we're saying the tyrannosaurs could have done. Okay, so that concludes my talk. I'm just going to take a few minutes to show you some of the fossils from the site. So I want to introduce to you Katja Knoll, the lab manager. And first off, we're going to look at some of the toe bones. Whoops, a little backwards for me. So here is the full adult toe bone. That's number 23 from the slide that you saw earlier. You can see it for scale, it's quite large. This is from an individual that approached 29.5 feet in length, almost 30 feet. So this is really large. And then we've got an individual here that's about 75% of that size. So that'd be a subadult. And then this tiny little guy, in contrast to the grown-up. So this is from the 4-year-old juvenile. Okay. This is actually a metatarsal, or one of the upper foot bones that this would join on to here from an adult. So these are huge animals. I just want to make that point. We're talking about some of the largest predatory animals to walk the face of the earth. I mean, the descended T-Rex was one of the largest predators to ever walk on dry land. And comparing the metatarsals, whoops, this is backwards for me, sorry. Comparing the metatarsals from the adult to a subadult or a juvenile here. So on the left, I've got a set of juvenile metatarsals, upper foot bones, articulated still partly, and then the adult on the right. You can see the vast size differences, the two individuals. And then these are skull bones from two of the individuals. This is the adult here on the right. It's called the lacrimal. It forms the front of the eye. And this is the exact same bone in the juvenile. Yeah, we got Katja in the background showing you the position of this bone. Just like that. So this is from a juvenile and this is an adult. And again, they're quite different. And there's a lot of development of a horn-like structure in the adult. So the juveniles are kind of flat and featureless, and then the adult gets this big hump and this big scabby boss from which a horn grew out of. Okay, yeah. And lastly, I'd like to show you one of the business ends of the mouths of one of these animals. This is a tooth from an adult This is the bottom of the tooth right here with the top of the crown here. So this is a good 7-8 inches long. This is huge. So, and about this much of it would have been sticking out of the jaw. So just imagine that punching through you. Terrifying. And it's covered with serrations, just like a steak knife for sawing through flesh. Okay. All right. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Selena Suarez. And she's going to talk about her work on the geochemistry. Thank you, Dr. Suarez.
Thanks, Dr. Titus. I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about the work that we've been doing here at the University of Arkansas. So for our part of the research, myself and my former PhD student, Dr. Daigo Yamamura, and I have been working closely with Dr. Titus to help answer various paleoenvironmental and paleoecological questions about the Comparowitz Formation ecosystem using geochemistry. Dr. Titus contacted us about possible geochemical tools that we could use to help understand the history of the Rainbows and Unicorns site. So we focused on two analytical methods, one being stable isotopes and stable isotope geochemistry, and the other being trace element geochemistry, or more specifically, the rare earth elements. So stable isotopes are atoms of the same element with different number of neutrons within the nucleus. I like to relate stable isotope to different types of or varieties of milk. So you have whole milk, 2% milk, skim milk, but in the long run, it's all milk, right? The only difference is there's different percentage of fat within the milk. So stable isotopes are really similar to that. We have different varieties of the same elements. In the case of our work, we are looking at oxygen and carbon isotopes. So they weigh slightly different between the different varieties of oxygen and carbon based off of the number of neutrons within the nucleus of the atom. So by analyzing the ratios of these atoms, we can track different things like whether or not an environment is wet or dry, temperature, whether or not there's a rain shower effect. We can look at diet, the type of water or the isotopic composition of water different animals are drinking. So we looked at stable isotope composition of the soil forming carbonates. Those were those white blobs that Dr. Titus was pointing out. And we looked at both those that were at the site underlying the main bone bed, as well as the ones that were entrained within the bones themselves. And the similarity of the oxygen isotopic composition of those nodules tells us that they were probably formed from the same water isotopic composition, so the same environment. We also looked at stable isotopes from the turtles to tell us that all the turtles were living in the same water environment as well. And then finally, by looking at the rare earth elements, those are the elements that are on the top row of the bottom part of the periodic table of elements. We were able to investigate the fossilization history of the bones. So rare earth elements are really useful elements for tracking fossilization history because they love the mineral that bone is made out of, which is apatite. The rare earth element concentration within the bones of the Tetraphonius, the turtles, the fish, the crocodilomorph, the Deinosuchus, and the carbonate nodules all have very similar rare earth element patterns. That is the relative proportions of the different types of rare earth elements. So this suggests that the bones all fossilized in a very similar environment and were not reworked into their final resting point from different pre-buried strata or from areas that were far flung from across the landscape and that were buried at various different times. So this supports our hypothesis that these tyrannosaurs died in this site, were all fossilized together. They all died together, and this information is key to our interpretation that the animals were likely gregarious in their behavior. So that summarizes the different things that we found from the geochemical point of view. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Titus. So back to you, Alan.
Thank you, Dr. Suarez. I do want to emphasize that her work was key for us finding the ultimate convincing argument that they were from the same place, because to prove that they were gregarious or that this reflects gregarious behavior, we had to prove that they were all buried in the same spot at the same time initially. And it was difficult to do because their original context had been destroyed by this exhumation and reburial by the river. So skeptics or critics could argue, oh, those things have been washed in from different places and different sources. But Dr. Suarez was able to show that was not the case. They had all been buried together. Thank you. Yeah, okay, now I'd like to go ahead and turn the time over to Dr. Joseph Sertich at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and he can elaborate on Tyrannosaur social behavior and dinosaur ecology and all the other things that come into play as we look at behavior and the patterns that we see in Laramidia.
Great, thank you, Dr. Titus. Yeah, so I'd like to share some of the work that we're doing here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. We're one of those many partner institutions with the monument at Grand Staircase Escalante, digging into the paleoecology and ecosystems that are preserved in the monument. And one of those most amazing ecosystems is that of the Caparowitz Formation. So looking at these dinosaurs from around 76 million years ago, and also digging up other aspects of the ecosystem, from the fossil plants to the mollusks, all the way up to these big tyrannosaurs. And my area of research focuses on the different dinosaurs and crocodiles from the monument. So working on things like Teratophonius, this amazing tyrannosaur dinosaur. And I was brought in to help decipher some of these big mysteries. So anytime you're working with a bone bed site, you're also looking at major issues in understanding how those animals died, and also the identification and number of individuals at a site. So this site was completely mixed up and reworked. Disarticulation was very common at the site. And so getting in and deciphering what those bones are and how many individuals were preserved at the site was one of those first keys we had to unlock before figuring out how this site accumulated. And the second aspect of the site was the taphonomy. So taking that, the fossil record from the death of the organisms all the way to their preservation. And so looking at different mechanisms for causing the death of a tyrannosaur social group was one of the big mysteries, because the site had been reworked, as Dr. Titus mentioned. So all these bones had been previously buried and then dug up and reburied. And so kind of like a medical examiner, we had to go in and determine possibilities or ways that these animals could have died originally. And so in a way, we were looking at all sorts of different evidence, as Dr. Suarez mentioned, to decipher the original kill mechanism. So how did this group, this potentially social group of tyrannosaurs, originally die? And then how did they become entombed in this mostly aquatic setting? And so by looking at different features of the bones, the ontogenetic series, so the range of different ages from very young juvenile to very mature adult, we were able to pretty confidently determine that this was a social or gregarious assemblage of tyrannosaurs that originally died in a lake flood setting. So we explored multiple different ways that these organisms could have died, from mires to poisoning. And the most parsimonious, or the simplest explanation, and one that matches really well with other tyrannosaur sites, is that these organisms were all these tyrannosaurs were killed in a flood, and then originally buried and exhumed and reburied with this amazing aquatic assemblage that includes turtles and crocodiles and fishes. And so I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Titus, and I think we're getting ready to answer some questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sertich. Yeah, we've reached the end of our presentation part of our event today. So we'd like now to actually turn it over to you guys watching the media and answer any questions you might have, or follow up, or just explore other topics that you'd like to.
Alan, I have a question from Sophia Ippolito from the Associated Press. The panelist is not identified, but Sophia, are you online right now?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, great. I was hoping, I know, Dr. Titus, you put up a map, but I was just hoping to get some clarification on in which part of Grand Staircase Escalante this discovery was made. Is it made inside the monument as it stands today, or were any of this site in parts of the monument that President Trump had kind of cut back?
Yeah, the site's located within the north central part of the Kaparowitz Plateau, within what we're now calling the Kaparowitz subunit of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, and it is still within the monument boundary even after the reduction.
Okay, great, Alan. Okay, I have a second question here from Katie Franson from the Wayne and Garfield County Insider. Question is for Dr. Sertich. Dr. Sertich, why would the king of dinosaurs, such a large and dominating predator, have to hunt in packs? Why would they have to use this strategy?
Yeah, so that's one of the big topics that we're exploring based on the evidence that they were social or gregarious. Why would you need to be a pack hunter, or why would you need to be in this social unit? And one of the big reasons is the diversity of very large herbivores on the scene. And so the same rocks that entombed this Teratophonius group also entombs amazing horned dinosaurs like Cosmoceratops and Utaceratops, and very large hadrosaurs like Gripposaurus and the crested Parasaurolophus. And so being in a social unit or a social gregarious assemblage, these tyrannosaurs might have had a better chance at taking on some of these really large or really dangerous herbivores on the scene.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sertich. Okay, question number 3. This comes from Juliet Elliperin from the Washington Post. Her question is for Dr. Titus. So let me see here. When Dr. Titus, when you showed Secretary Haaland the fossils earlier this month, did you share this find, and what did she say about protecting the monument's treasure trove? I know that we did show Secretary Haaland the paleontology lab, but we did not have time to visit any fossil sites on the monument. Alan, could you please talk about the DOI and the BLM's commitment to protect these fossils within the
monument? Yeah, so Secretary Haaland did come through the lab, and I was able to show her some of the fossils from the site, but we didn't have a chance to get in the field. She was quite inquisitive and appreciated getting to see the material, took some photos. But the BLM is protecting these fossils as national treasures. They're basically our heritage. Our ancient heritage, I might add, our way back heritage, but they're part of the story of how North America came to be and how ultimately we came to be. So we take protecting and conserving these resources very seriously. We have federal laws like the Paleontological Resource Preservation Act, which gives us the tools we need to enforce and protect, and we take that very seriously.
Thanks, Alan. I have another follow-up question for you, Alan. This is from Amy O'Donoghue from the Deseret News. She would like to know how you arrived at the name of the site.
That's a great story. Actually, a former employee of mine, who's now the lab manager up at the Natural History Museum in Salt Lake, I guess he thought I was a little too enthusiastic about every fossil site I'd ever found, and everything was always so great, so fabulous, and I can't believe how awesome this is. And so he was talking to my current field hand, and he said, "Come on, Scott, we all know with Alan Titus, it's always rainbows and unicorns all the time. Tell me about this site. What's it really like?" And Scott said, "Tyler, this site really is rainbows and unicorns." And so the name just stuck after that. And then that first field season, we bought a little rainbow-colored unicorn mascot and took him out to the site, and he oversaw all of our excavation for the next several years. So yeah, rainbows and unicorns was initially a jab at me, but it just seemed so appropriate for the site.
Rainbows and unicorns. I have another follow-up for you from Brian Mathley from the Salt Lake Tribune.
Yeah.
He asks, could you address what makes this discovery different from the Allosaur death assemblages at the Cleveland Lloyd?
That's a great question. So there is the largest accumulation of large predatory dinosaur fossils on the planet is also in Utah. That's at the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, now within the new Jurassic National Monument. And the differences between these two sites are at Cleveland Lloyd, it looks like you're in a semi-arid environment to begin with. There's almost no aquatic fauna. There aren't large turtles and large fish and big giant gators and things like that. It appears to have a much more terrestrial signature, and the bones themselves tend to be weighted towards larger individuals. Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most of the individuals at Cleveland Lloyd are sort of sub-adult, large juvenile to full adult. We don't see a lot of really tiny animals in there, suggesting a bias in the age that's being killed there. And this is very typical of what we call attritional assemblages. Animals being pulled into an area one at a time over a number of years or over some indefinite period of time, and dying there, over an extended period of time, rather than a single catastrophic event. And then they're also associated with a large number of potential prey animals, like large sauropods, the big long-necked dinosaurs, and Stegosaurus, the plate-back things. And so you have a lot of mixing of different kinds of dinosaurs, which again is unusual unless you're looking at a situation like a dying water hole or some sort of other trapping mechanism over time. So it's unlikely that Cleveland Lloyd represents a single event. Whereas we concluded at Rainbows that the death of all these large predatory dinosaurs was related to a single event. So I hope that answers your question. So Cleveland Lloyd would be more akin to something like the La Brea tar pits, where you have hundreds and hundreds of dire wolves and saber-toothed tigers trapped at the site, but they're not all dying at the same time.
Okay, Alan, thank you. We're down to our remaining last 5 minutes, so I have 2 more questions here. This question, again, is for Dr. Titus. This question comes from Sophie Will from the Spectrum. Have the monument boundaries and the controversy surrounding the boundaries disrupted your work, Alan?
Well, I haven't noticed any disruption to my work. The fossils are all still there. So, I can't really say that there's been any significant disruption to the work that we're doing in our program.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this final question comes from Carter Williams from KSL News, NBC affiliate. And the question is, the panelists are not identified. So Carter, are you with us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Carter. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I don't know if this is for Dr. Surich or for Dr. Titus, but this was mentioned by Dr. Titus. He mentioned that it was sort of controversial in the sense of how this theory was beforehand about how these dinosaurs acted together.
Yes.
I guess, could you explain a little bit about what made this so controversial? And do you feel like that this is the final evidence needed to prove this theory about how the tyrannosaurs hunted together?
Okay, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a stab at that question, but I would also like to turn it over to Dr. Surich for follow-up in case I missed something, because I think this is an important point to the work that we're doing. I have talked to many tyrannosaur researchers, and a couple in particular are quite insistent that these animals simply did not have the brain power, the intelligence to engage in sophisticated social interaction and division of labor among hunting and mentoring of young for extended periods, and just all of the complexity that goes along with what we call parasocial behavior, like a pack of wolves or a pride of lions. They would say their behavior is probably no more sophisticated than what we see in modern alligators or crocodiles. Now, that's not to say that alligators and crocodiles aren't social. alligators and crocodiles are gregarious. But we see particular patterns in their behavior, and they're not cooperating. A group of alligators do not cooperate to take down a deer or an elk or some large prey animal. They're hunting solitary. They generally gather during the mating season. Males have harems and will patrol sections of rivers or lakes and sort of tolerate certain other males if they're not representing breeding competition. But really, it's not particularly sophisticated, and it's not highly coordinated, and they're certainly not cooperatively hunting, like I gave in the Harris hawk example. And so the skepticism lies in, did these animals actually have the brain power to engage in such complicated social behavior? And I think, with tyrannosaurs, you're looking at a unique lineage of dinosaurs, of predatory dinosaurs, called the Coelurosauria. And one of the key features in these animals is they have an enlarged brain. They actually have a larger cranial volume than their carnosaur ancestors. And so we interpret that as opening the door for potential increased computing power, if you will, in the brain, and the evolution of some social behaviors. So with that answer, I'm going to turn it over to the real expert, Dr. Sertich.
Yeah, I think that's great, Dr. Titus. The one thing I would add is that a main reason it's so controversial is because the fossil record typically doesn't preserve great evidence of behavior. So we have fossils, we have amazing bones, we can study organisms, but going that next step to understand behavior and how animals behaved requires really amazing evidence. And I think that this site, the spectacular accumulation of tyrannosaurs, but also the other assembled pieces of evidence that came from work by Dr. Suarez and others, really puts that tipping point, really pushes us to the point where we can actually show some evidence for behavior. And so I think that is also controversial among paleontologists, is finding the sites that preserve enough detail that we can actually infer how these animals not only lived, but how they behaved as they were alive.
Yeah, I have one more thought on that too. And that is, each one of these sites, the Dry Island site in Canada, the Montanan site with Daspletosaurus horneri, which I really didn't talk about, and the Rainbows and Unicorns site, represent a highly improbable event, right? Killing and burying and preserving a large group of terrestrial predators. I mean, you don't see that happen very often in the modern environment. And so we're talking about an extraordinary set of circumstances, a very rare and improbable event. And if we see that event keep repeating itself over and over again, both in the north and the south of this ancient Laramidian landmass, it's starting to suggest that there may be some bias, some behavior of the tyrannosaurs that's allowing them to keep getting caught up and buried en masse like this, as opposed to Allosaurus. I don't know of a single catastrophic mass kill of Allosaurus if Cleveland Lloyd isn't such an example. It's very unusual to find this, and yet it keeps repeating itself with tyrannosaurs. So there's an argument just by the statistics and looking at the probabilities that this must be reflecting some sort of behavior rather than just a freak event occurring over and over again. It's biased by their actual behavior.
Hey, Dr. Suarez, Dr. Sertich, I want to thank each of you for your time and for being here with us today. I want to thank our audience as well. If you have any questions, please direct them to me at dherscher@blm.gov, and we'll put that email address into the chat. Additional resources will also be available on the BLM website, and you can, of course, learn more about the research through the article in PureJ or by following BLM Utah on our social media pages.
Okay, I'm going to take off for
event. And thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Selena.
Sure thing.